Happy coding.
Hey there, Kevin Workman here, and welcome to our next video in our series of Intro to Web Dev. Last week we learned about CSS, or cascading style sheets, and that let you add styling to your page, things like colors, different font sizes, things like background colors, background images, and that's a great start. It's a way to add some pizzazz to your boring HTML content, but we didn't quite get into moving stuff around on the screen. And that is what we are going to talk about this week, which is doing layout in CSS. And the way that I think about this is through basically a history lesson, and that's kind of how I'm going to frame this week's sort of lecture here. Um, so before I do all of that, let me get myself sort of situated. And by that, I mean like setting up my environment here. And I'm doing this explicitly on camera because I haven't shown this to y'all yet. And this is just a way that I tend to set up my coding environment so that it's a little easier for me to navigate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my window. So I have, let me go back to here. Yeah, pay no attention to me. This is nonsense. So I'm going to start on my NeoCities dashboard here. So get that up and running if you want to follow along. But once I'm there, what I'm going to do is a couple of things. So I have my like sort of top level files and they're fine. I also have my directories from the last couple of weeks, and I have my Scratch directory. The Scratch directory is just there for me to have like a temporary place to add random bits of code as I talk through things. And I recommend having one of your own, but you do you. So I'm going to go into that, and this directory has two files. Right now, they're both kind of empty. So CSS file does not contain anything, and my index file contains this HTML, which is, as always, I'm talking about bees. So I've got my H1, I've got a P tag. Let me zoom in a little bit. Ugh, I'm zooming in the wrong thing. I've got a UL tag with some LIs and another P tag. So I'm going to hit the view button here. And this is where I'm going to sort of rearrange my windows. So I'm going to make this whole window sort of take up half of my screen, roughly half, maybe a little more than that. And sure, good enough. And then I'm going to pop this like website out into its own window. And sure, that looks okay. And what this lets me do is have my code sort of over here on the left, and then the resulting web page over here on the right. And this is a way to be able to quickly go back and forth without needing to like switch a bunch of tabs and kind of juggle with that. For the first couple of weeks, I think that's okay, but now that we're getting into some more involved topics, this is generally how I recommend working. So now I have my Scratch pad open, and I can like sort of show you like why I do it this way. So I'm going to make this a little bigger. Sure. And I'm going to add just a little thing like be a beautiful bees website. And what I'm going to be able to do is hit save, and then immediately over here refresh and see it without like losing my spot in my code or anything. So that's what I've got. And again, over here, it's just your standard HTML, and I don't have any styling or anything like that yet. So for a quick review, what we talked about last time was CSS, and there's a few ways to do that. So I could go into my style.css file, and if I was going to do that, I would probably open this up in a new tab and then open this up in a new tab so that I have sort of my HTML, my CSS, and then my result. That would work. But I think for now, I'm going to just put it in like a style tag. Just so I have it sort of in the same screen and I can talk about it and like reference back and forth. So what we learned about last week is sort of foundational CSS, which lets you add styles like colors, fonts, backgrounds, that kind of thing, margins, borders, etc., etc. So just as a quick example, I'm going to make this a little bigger, sure, and use an H1 element selector and change its color to red. And then I'm going to refresh over here. And sure enough, this is red. And that is where we were last week. And that's great. It will let you add styling and colors and fonts and all that kind of stuff to your content. But now we are getting into the idea of layout. And to very roughly describe what I mean by layout, it means moving stuff around in the screen. So let's say I wanted this whole paragraph to show up over here, like to the right of this this section here. How would I do that? And the answer depends on what year it is. And so right now, if I wanted to move that over to the right, there are actually many, many, many ways to do that. And I personally have found that really confusing until I went back and sort of read about the history of like HTML and CSS. Because the reason there are so many different ways to do layout in CSS is because over the years, more ways have been added. And so you sort of still have your really old ways floating around. That's accidentally a pun that I'll come back to later, maybe. And you have your newer ways. And the newer ways are generally a little bit better, but the older ways are still around. You'll still find tutorials about them. You'll still find examples. And if you like inspect element on a web page, they might use an old way. So I believe that understanding like how we got where we are helps understand like how to do layout in CSS. Okay, so with that in mind, we are going to get in a time machine and we're going to go back in time to 1993. So let's go in our time machine and we're in there and it go do, 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 do. That's the time machine noise. And we are stepping out and it's 1993. So I don't know, picture what the world would have looked like back then. I was 7 years old, so living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and you know, the world looks quite different back then. Cell phones weren't really a thing yet, and most people didn't even have computers. The internet was barely a thing. But in 1993, this is when HTML is first invented. And we talked about that a little bit way back in the first week, the history of the web and the internet and all that stuff. But that's where we are. We're in 1993. And back when HTML was first developed, there was no CSS. So adding styles, adding that kind of thing just wasn't a thing. So I'm going to maybe get rid of some of this. Hit save and refresh. Now, there were ways to sort of style your HTML using HTML tags, like special HTML tags. So I don't know, things like the center HTML tag was a thing. And this worked back then. Right now it says like it's not supported in modern HTML. That's sort of a lie. This will still work in most browsers, but there's like not a guarantee that it will continue to work, and you're not really supposed to use them anyway. But anyway, back to 1993, the only way that we could really style things or lay things out was with HTML tags. And specifically, layout was done with a tag called the table tag. And again, my goal is to sort of get this paragraph over to the right. So how would I do that in 1993 was to use a table tag. So I'm going to say HTML table and sure, W3 schools. And so the table tag sets up a table of generally data, like a spreadsheet kind of looking thing. And you can have a table. TR is table row. TH is table header or heading. table data, and all that good stuff. So if I open this up, this is what it ends up looking like. I've got a row that is the header, and then some cells inside of that table. So a table is defined by the table tag on the outside, and then nested inside of that is each row, table row, and then inside of that is your table datas. And so if I look at, I don't know, these folks, Alfred's, Maria, and Germany, if I go over here, that is in a row, Alfred's, Maria, and Germany. I don't really know what this is, but I guess just examples. So I want to go do that over in my HTML because I'm in 1993 and this is how we did things. So just to get started, maybe what I'll do is I'll just create kind of an arbitrary table over here. Can I make that a little bigger? Sure. So I'm over here and I'm just going to make a table. So I'm going to use the table tag. And the way I tend to write HTML is to always give myself my closing tag and some white space. And then I want a table row inside of it. Close that. And then I want two sort of table datas. I'm pretty sure that's what TD stands for. It could be wrong. And then in here, I want like left and right. And this is kind of just an arbitrary table kind of in the middle of everything. And there it is, left and right, all the way up there. And I could add something like a border. So using old school HTML only, I believe there's an attribute. So I could say border equals 1, save that and refresh. And there we go. We have a table with a cell on the left and a cell on the right, using these like 6-ish lines of code. And okay, so I have my table. And what I really want to do is put my content inside that table. And so I can do that. I'm going to cut and paste and stuff. So I can't see my keyboard here, but if I cut that out and I'm going to put it where the left was, and I'm going to fix my white space. I kind of wish that NeoCity's editor had a auto format button. Some editors do, but I'll do it the old fashioned way. So I'm going to save this and refresh. And there we go. I have this section sort of on the left, and this is still just my placeholder of right. But if I move this whole thing, Control X into here, and then I'm going to be a little annoying about my white space. And one more, sure. And I'll hit save and then refresh. And I'll zoom back out. And sure enough, there's my left section and my right section. I can get rid of my border maybe, because I added that just to be able to see it. But if I get rid of it, whoops, and I refresh, there we go. I sort of have my left section over here and my right section over here. And as I change the size of my window, my right section will kind of grow. And there you have it. And that's more or less how we did things in 1993. I will, again, maybe say, like, I'm using the word we. I was 7. I wasn't coding HTML back in 1993, but we collectively as web developers, this is how it was kind of done. And there's sort of a famous example of this, so maybe I'll show you that just for funsies. Let me make that window bigger again. And so we're back in time in like 1993-ish, and there's a wonderful film by the name of Space Jam. And I think it came out in like 1985-ish, and they had a website. And this is kind of a famous website because it's very, very old school, but they kept it around. It still exists. So back in 1996, I guess it was, Space Jam was released, the original version of it, and they released a website, which back in the day was kind of a new thing. Nowadays, every single movie has a website and many social media accounts and all the things. But back then, this was kind of a new thing. And they kept this site live in the exact same condition that it was when they released it back in 1996. So this is what I'm going to. And here it is in all of its glory. Isn't it beautiful? And if I use the inspect element feature that we talked about last time, I can see how this was done. So I'm going to right click and hit inspect. I'll make this a little bigger, and yeah, here we go. Sure enough, if I, that's gross. If I make this a little bigger, Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, roughly. This is indeed a table. And we have table rows. Inside of those, we have TD. They're using some other attributes that help sort of format the table. I didn't really bother doing that with mine, but you can like change the size of the individual cells and whatnot. But that's what this is. This is a table with table rows and table datas inside with things like images and links and whatnot. And this is how it worked. And so I don't know if you want to click around in that and see like exactly how they do it. That's kind of a fun like museum almost of how things used to work. But that is how we did things back in 1993 or so. How do I make you smaller again? Yeah, there you go. Okay, so that's roughly how we did things back then. And this was kind of, okay, but not great. You can see that like I'm needing to have like many tags to lay things out. And if you look at the Space Jam website, there's a lot of attributes that you have to play with. And as content changes, you have to change your table, and it's a whole thing. So we are going forward in time. We are traveling from 1993. I guess we are in 1996 because it's Space Jam. So we already time traveled. But in 1996, this is when the first version of CSS was released. And this version of CSS had things like colors and fonts, but no layout. So this is basically what you played around with last week. It's colors, styling, backgrounds, margins, borders, all that stuff, but not things that let you move stuff around. So back in like 1996, we were still mostly using tables for layout. Now we're traveling forward in time one more year. Now it's 1997, and HTML has continued to evolve. And one of the things they introduce is a new tag called the div tag. And this will become more and more important, but by itself, it doesn't really do much. The div tag is really like a division tag, I think. And it's really just like, I think of it as a rectangle. It's an arbitrary rectangle around some other HTML tag. So I don't know, for example, I can put this whole section inside a div. And so I have an open div tag, and I want to have a closing div tag here. And this really shouldn't change anything, because I'm drawing a sort of arbitrary division around some content. So I'm going to hit save and refresh. And yeah, nothing really changed. But what this lets me do is maybe I'll add like a class equals, I don't know, left. And I'm going to style it over here. Dot class. So I'm using sorry, that's the wrong thing. I'm using a class selector. It's hard to talk and type at the same time. But I'm going to select the left class, and then I'm going to give it, I don't know, a border of thin, solid, I don't know, blue. I want to save that and refresh. And yeah, so this lets me, maybe I'll make it thicker, thick, solid blue, and refresh. Sure. And this lets me sort of draw a rectangle around certain content, around around some contained content. So now instead of having a p tag and a ul tag, I have a div that contains those things. And so I can style the div, and that's a thing. That's a thing I can do now. Before you couldn't really have like a section unless you had something like a table data. So div is just an arbitrary unit of content that can include other HTML tags. And this will become way more important as we keep going. So that is 1997. We have that. And let me see. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add another div here. And I will give that a class of right. And I'll just have that contain a single p tag /div, and I will style that with a border of, I don't know, red. So dot right, border, thick, solid red. Save that and refresh. And okay, there we go. So I just have two divs, and this will come in handy in a second. Okay, so we are traveling forward in time again. We are going from 1997 to 1998. And at this point, CSS releases a set of new features, and these features are devoted to doing layout. Because while the table element will work for doing layout, it's pretty unwieldy and it's pretty horrible for tools like screen readers. So if you're not familiar, imagine like a user who is blind and can't see the screen, and they're trying to navigate the internet. They use a tool often called a screen reader, and your phone comes with a screen reader. Most devices do these days. And what the screen reader does is like exactly what it says in the name. It reads the screen to the user, so that even if you're blind, you can navigate the web and make appointments and talk to your friends and all the things. But if you're using a screen reader and the website that is being read uses a table, it treats it not as text and content, but as data, which is what the table element was originally designed for. And so it breaks a lot of things for a lot of people. So the table element, while it works, is not really recommended for doing layout. And so in 1998, we're at, CSS released a new set of properties that were devoted to doing layout without needing to be a table. So I want to get rid of my table. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. And get rid of all of that. And what I'm left with is two divs, basically. So I'm going to fix my white space because I'm annoying. And sure. So what I have now is an h1 and a div that contains a p tag and a ul, and another div that contains just a p tag. And right now the only styling on my divs are borders. And I feel like I need to fix my white space even more, but I should resist this because it's not the point. But I can't help myself. All right. So if we refresh over here, we are back to like I don't have a table anymore. And so I just have a div, which is an arbitrary rectangle, and another div. And so they're just sort of by default vertically stacked on top of each other. This is exactly how it was before. If I didn't have the divs, and I just had like my p tags, my ul, and my other p tag, this is how they would display, just not with those borders. So again, my goal is still to get this thing, this section, to the right of this section. Or another way to say it is I want this to be to the left of this section. And so how I can do that in 1998 is I can use the new feature, which is floats. So there's my pun from earlier. So I have my div with a class of left, and I'm going to style that. So I already have my selector here. So in here, I'm going to say float : left. And I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to refresh. And yeah, that sort of works, because what I have now is my section here, which has the blue border, is now to the left of the content that is around it. But is this what I want? I'm not sure, because it's sort of like it's kind of inside the right element, and it's kind of unwieldy this way. So when you are using floats, you often have to set things like margins and like widths and that kind of thing. And so it works, but it's a little annoying. So let's say if I wanted to float this left, I have to move my right over a little bit. So I want to say like margin left of 200 pixels, maybe. I'm just kind of eyeballing that, and let me refresh. All right, maybe 200 wasn't quite enough. Maybe like 225, maybe. So save and refresh, and sure, this is looking okay. Um, but the challenge is that every time I sort of update the content, I have to mess with these numbers. And this is just a simple example with two things next to each other. Many websites contain like lots of things left and right. So you can imagine how complicated it gets. But I don't know, let's say I wanted to say, it's like, here are some, I don't know, really, really interesting facts about bees. What should happen? Well, we're going to refresh, and that's what happens. And like, is that what I want? I don't know. Probably not. So now I have to like go back in and mess with this, and maybe I can do that by adding like a width, maybe of 200 pixels or something, maybe. And yeah, that kind of works, but like you see how like every time I change my content, I sort of have to mess with my floated divs, and it works, but it's annoying. However, this is how we did it for a really long time. Actually, we're now in 1998, and we are dealing with floats. I will say there's also another feature called blocks or inline blocks. I'm not going to get into those because my main point here is we're traveling through history. So there's other stuff, but floats are really popular. Another one you might see is blocks, but either way, they they work, but they're annoying. And in the backdrop of, you know, society, of history, we started out in, 1993 with like tiny little screens, and most screens were like 640 by 480 pixels, which is really tiny. And so, that's kind of why the default is just to show it vertically, because that's what made sense on their original computers. And over time, we're now in like the year 2000 or so. Um, Monitors are getting bigger, and there's a sort of do I still have my width here? Yeah, I do. Whatever. We're gonna see what happens. So there's sort of a challenge as monitors are getting bigger. Is this what I want my website to look like? Maybe not. But there's another challenge where not everybody has the same monitor. So some people's monitors are really wide, some people's monitors are smaller. Generally, through history, they're getting bigger and bigger, but not everybody replaces their monitor at the same time. And so now we're roughly in the year, I don't know, 2007 ish. And it's already kind of complicated because of the problem I just mentioned, where different folks have different sized monitors. And so, how do you make your website look good on all of those different monitors? And around 2007, that's when smartphones start being a thing. And so now all of a sudden, not only do you have monitors, but you have like the first iPhone, which has a teeny tiny screen. And that had an internet browser. I mean, other phones could access the internet before, but really, like the smartphone is when it started to really be a thing. Um, and so now you're worried about what your website looks like on a big monitor, and you're worried about what that same website looks like on a teeny tiny phone. And so there's a bunch of different things that folks did, but really we were kind of stuck with floats and blocks for quite some time. So we're still going forward in time, and we are now at the year 2017, which is not that long ago. So for a like basically 20 years, we used floats and blocks. We did it this way. But in 2017, to address the challenges that I just outlined, a new feature was released as part of CSS 3, and that is called Flexbox. And all of this time travel that I spent 30 minutes on was to get to Flexbox, because Flexbox is basically the modern way of doing all of this. And I will sort of walk you through what that looks like here. So I have to change a couple of things really quick. So I'm going to get rid of my floats and my widths and stuff. I'm going to get rid of all that. And so I'm going sort of back to just the border. And yeah, sure. And then I am going to hit refresh. So this should go back to just being vertical and cool. And then the next thing I want to do is, there's a couple things, is I am going to add another div, like just a container div, and I'm debating where to put that. I'm going to put it here. So I'm going to add another div, and I'm going to give it a class of, I am terrible with coming up with names. I'm going to call it like flex-container. Maybe I'll call it, you know what? I'm not going to obsess over it. I'm going to call it flex-container. And I'm going to close out my div down here. And so now what I have is one div that contains two divs. So is that lined up? Not really. There it is. And flex container, I will give its own border up here. So dot flex dash container and border, running out of colors, thick, solid, green. Sure. And I'm going to save and refresh. And it's hard to see, but I do have like a green box around the blue box and the red box. So it's sort of an arbitrary rectangle that is around the rest of the content. And here's the magic. Again, my overall goal is to get this red box to the right of the blue box. And we've seen a couple different ways to do that. I'm also going to delete some of this just to go back to normalcy. Okay, so I want this blue box to the left of the red box or the red box to the right of the blue box. And how I'm going to do that is by over here on my flex container, I'm going to say display : flex. And what this is going to do is tell the browser to stop using the default layout of just putting stuff on top of each other, like vertically, and instead use this new layout, which is new as of 2017, and play by its rules instead. So if I just refresh over here, there we go. I have a blue section over here, which is to the left of my red section over here. And all I needed to do, all I needed to have was one line. And there's a bunch of things I can do from here. So, the sizing is a little wonky. The fact that this is like a really long paragraph is kind of messing things up. So just for a second, I'm going to delete some of this. Sure. And I'll refresh just to see what that looks like. And yeah, so one of the powerful features of Flexbox is you don't really have to mess with individual, really minute pixel sizes. It just sort of lays it out kind of logically. So when this does not have a bunch of content in it, it's kind of small. When it does have a ton of content in it, it's a lot bigger. But maybe that's not what we want. So let me think about how I want to do this. Sure. So I have enabled the flex layout, and there are, you know what? I'm going to actually go back to this being tiny because that is going to help me talk about this. I'll come back to this. I'm going to save that somewhere, and I'll just say like bees. Whoops. Bees are fascinating. Hit save and sure. Okay. So I want to talk about just generally how you work with Flex, and then I'll come back to like making it look nicer. Okay. So I've got my Flex container, which is the green box, and then I have two children, the blue box and the red box. The way Flex works is you specify properties on both the container and on its children. So I have my Flex container here. Right now it only contains the single property display Flex, and I have my children here, and they don't really have any like Flex specific properties. But to show you an example, I'm going to add, so right now I have my container and then I have my blue child and my red child. And by default, Flex is sort of showing them horizontally and then kind of smushing them to as small as they will like reasonably fit, and then putting them sort of all the way to the left. But maybe that's not how I want them to be laid out. And remember back in, I don't know, 1998 or so, when I was using floats, I could specify like a left margin, things like that to move it around a bit. If I'm using Flex, it's a little easier. So I'm going to here inside my container, use a property called justify content, and I'll use a value called space dash between. These are like regular old CSS properties, but if I hit save and refresh, this is going to tell the browser to, well, tell Flex to lay my children out by adding space between them. There's other values that I can use. So I think space around is another one. So space between sort of separates them as much as they will go. If I refresh, space around sort of just kind of spreads them around kind of evenly. Actually, I think, wait, is space evenly even a thing? Actually, I think. Yeah, so like different spacing, and I can maybe like play with that in the developer tools here. So if I have my Flex container, and ooh, that's annoying. I'm all the way down here. So instead of space evenly, let's see what my options are. If I hit backspace, now I have this handy, oh, it's right above my head, right there. I can center them. I can align them to the right. I can align them to the left, which I think is the default. I can put them like sort of around like that, between, evenly, and yeah, back to the beginning. And the power of Flex is that I'm not really worried about the exact pixel values anymore. So what this will look like on, you know, a really wide monitor is pretty reasonable. If I have like a really tiny monitor, it's still pretty reasonable. And I'm not messing with individual pixel values. I'm just trusting that Flex is powerful enough to, well, flex depending on the size of the screen. Okay, so that is adding a property to the Flex container. I can also add properties to the Flex children. So let me see where I'm at. If I refresh, there we go. And so for example, by default, I believe like children inside of a Flex container will be sized basically according to whatever content they have. But let's say that I wanted things to like grow or shrink differently. So I'm starting out on like a teeny tiny monitor over here, and as it grows, let's say I wanted the blue box to take up more room. And I can do that by saying left over here. So there's another property called flex-grow, and I'm going to give that a value of, I don't know, I'm going to start with 1. And I'm going to refresh. And you can see that my blue box is taking up basically all of the room, because I'm saying as you grow, get bigger. And maybe this 1 doesn't really make sense, because what is it in relation to? And what this does is it lets you specify basically like ratios between the children. So if I say flex grow of 2 over here, this is saying these are sort of in relation to each other. So I'm saying this child will grow at a rate of 1, and this child will grow at a rate of 2. So basically this red section will grow twice as fast as the blue section. So I'm going to start small, and then I'm going to refresh. And as I have bigger and bigger like real estate, you can sort of tell that both are growing. You know, if I look here, you know, they're both kind of skinny. If I get here, there's more white space in both of them. However, there's more white space in the red one. In fact, it's roughly twice as much, because it's relative to each other. So that's Flex Grow. And really the high level sort of conceptual thing I'm hoping that you're getting out of this is what Flex lets you do is specify properties on the container element and on the children elements to customize the way that your page is laid out without needing to worry about individual pixel values and margins and what happens when your content changes. So for example, I said I would bring that text back, and I'm a little nervous, honestly, because I didn't test this ahead of time. But let's see what happens. If I add this back in and I hit save and I hit refresh. Yeah, so the blue is taking up, so it's annoying because this p tag wants to just be one really long line. And so what I can do is maybe I'll try this actually, because the next thing I want to talk about is we have the overall idea that you can set properties on containers and children. And so it becomes a question similar to when we learned about CSS and there being different properties and values. It became a question of what properties and values are out there. Well, with Flex, it's the same question. What properties are on the container and what properties are on the children? And there's a bunch of ways we can look that up. MDN and W3 schools are great resources as always, but probably the best resource that I've seen is one called CSS Tricks, and I was going to say Flexbox maybe. And yeah, this. So this page is great because it has sort of representations of what happens, and it splits it up. On the left is properties that you put on the parent container, and then properties that you put sort of on the children inside of that container. And so I'm looking for one that will specify, like, I don't know, like a starting width or something. So here's like Flex Grow that we talked about. Here's how you can tell it to like wrap to the next line. Flex basis. This defines the default size of an element before the remaining space is distributed. Let's see. I am going to try that. I don't know. I haven't prepared this. Let's see what happens. So if I say flex basis of my right is, I don't know, let's give it 50% maybe. So I'm hoping that this means take up half of the parent container. Yeah, I did. Cool. So it's saying whatever you start at, make it be 50% of the parent. And then I'm guessing as I make it bigger, then that's where the flex grow is kicking in, where they're growing at the rates that are based on, well, they're based on a couple of things, but this is growing roughly twice as much as this one. I think it's actually growing a little more because the content in this is so big, but in the end, I'm not really worried about the individual values because this is, reasonable. And I can play with it, make this like a 3 or, different values to see what happens. But in general, I'm pretty okay with that because I'm using Flex in the way that it was intended, which is by setting properties on the container and on the children. So you can go through, and here's one we saw earlier, justify content. Let's see if there's any other interesting ones. So yeah, like align items. I think stretch might be the default. So let's say I didn't want this to fill up the whole height. Let's say I wanted them to be centered. Let's see what happens. So that's align items, and that's on the container. So if I say align items center, save that and refresh. And yeah, okay. Now this blue section, which is a little smaller, is centered sort of vertically. And that's because I am assigning these properties to both the containers and the children. Okay, so that is that is Flexbox. And right now, I am sort of guessing that you're like, whoa, that was way too much to be thrown at me. And again, I've said this before, my goal for you is not to memorize a bunch of HTML tags or a bunch of CSS properties or a bunch of Flex properties in this case. It is to teach you how to learn more about this stuff. And so if you don't really have any other takeaways, the takeaways so far are if you want to move stuff around in the screen, depending on how big the monitor is, then Flexbox is your best friend. And the way you use Flexbox or Flex is by having a container element with display flex on it. And then you add various properties to both that container and its children to customize the way Flex sort of plays out. So there's only two more things I want to chat about. And let's see, I'm at 45-ish minutes. I'll try to do them within the hour. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of nesting layouts. And this is a really powerful idea because you're not really limited to just one layout. You can have multiple layouts sort of inside of each other. And so what I'm going to do is, I don't know, maybe I'll go back to Microsoft Paint actually, and I will say that the way I think about a website before I am setting it up is I roughly think about it in terms of where are my divs? Like, what are my divs doing? And then I think about like what's inside those divs. So let's say, I don't know, I didn't really prepare this ahead of time. I wanted 3 divs in a row. So I'll say, here's my left div, and maybe I want like a big middle section, and then maybe a right div. Oops, a right div, sure. And then in each, and this is like when I am designing a website, this is what I'm thinking about. Like I'm usually doing it either mentally or like I'll get out a piece of paper and sketch it out, but I'm thinking about my big sections. And then let's say in here, maybe this is just like a UL, some LIs. And sure, and then over here, maybe just for the sake of time and demonstration, I'll say that's another like just ULs. This could be really anything. So I could say this is actually going to be, I don't know, an image to the left of some text. Maybe that's what I want over there. And I can think that what I might do, whoops, is have my overall sort of container. So I'll draw a container. I might have a container, and maybe this container is Flex. And then its children, maybe this is just a div with some ULs in it. Maybe this is a div with more content in it. And maybe this is a div with an image with float left. Nothing is stopping me from doing that. In fact, that's like a really common thing to do is to like mix and match different layouts. I'll say often if you're using Flex, you would probably use Flex for everything, but the general idea is still pretty applicable. Because you can have like very different Flex properties in each section. So let's say, for example, I wanted this to show, I don't know, maybe a set of images sort of next to each other like that. And I want them to be aligned. And so maybe this is its own div, and this is Flex as well, with these as the children. And so I don't know, I'm tempted to try to build that out. Let's see, I'll give myself just a couple minutes. And maybe I'll make it just a little harder for myself. I want that to be a div, and I want some text here, something like that. And what I'm thinking about is in terms of divs. And what would the layout be? What would the relationship between them be? So I'll put this somewhere. Running out of real estate. I'll put it I'll just minimize it. So let's say that's the thing I wanted to build. So I can do that by thinking in terms of like a hierarchy. So I've already forgotten what it looks like because my brain doesn't work, but I want to maybe start with my outermost div, which is my container, which has a left nav, a section in the middle, and a right nav, for example. So I'm going to have left and right, and maybe I'll say this is center for now. And I'm going to have another div with a class of right, actually. So div class equals right and slash div, and maybe I'll have more bee facts. I don't know. Here are some more facts about bees. And I'll say they have a pollen basket. That's a little thing on their legs. They have a honey crop. That's a little thing in their bellies. And I don't know, they have stingers. That's a little thing on their stinger. And so what do I have so far? Even with just that, I think I've gotten pretty far because I have a flex container and I have a left, a center, and a right. And then I have some content in each. And I'm only going to style my center by saying I'm running out of colors. Border is, I don't know, thick, solid, yellow. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to refresh. Give myself some room. Refresh. And there we go. Now I have my left section, my middle section, and my right section. And I can continue to play with things like flex grow. Maybe I want my blue and my red to be a little bigger. So maybe I'll say flex basis on right is, you know what, I'm not going to mess with it. Maybe, in fact, I'm going to get rid of all this. Let's see what happens. Refresh. Will that do something reasonable? Not really. But I've got my left and my center and my right. I'm tempted to try to mess with this, but let's say if I said like flex basis, I don't know, 25%, and this is flex basis, I don't know, 50%, and then this is flex basis of 25%. Let's see if that works. Yeah, roughly. All right, cool. So maybe that's a little more reasonable. And as I grow, they grow, and as I shrink, they shrink. Fine. So if I compare this to my beautiful Microsoft Paint rendition, I'm pretty close already. I just need my images. And so I'm thinking about where do my images go in relation to my other divs. And so if I look at this, I think my images might be inside of another div, and that div might be inside of my center div. So if I go back to my content, inside of my center, I've got this big P tag, but maybe I want another div, and maybe I'll call this like class equals, I don't know, image container. I'll give myself some white space slash div, and oh boy, I need a image. Did I have one in this directory? No, maybe I have one at the top. Sorry, what did I call this? Maybe in week 2. I had flowers in week 2, and what did I have? Okay, that's the only one. I could upload a new one, and maybe I will, actually. I'm tempted, so bear with me 1 second. I need a bee picture, and let's see. This is one I haven't used before, so I'm just going to drag that over. And sure, maybe this one, and you know, funsies, maybe one more. And I'm going to rename these actually because that'll make my life easier. So I'm going to rename this to B1. Rename. Where'd that go? Oh, wait, where'd that go? Maybe it'll load in a second. I'll name this B2. Oh, it's because I'm renaming it. This is annoying. All right, so that's good to know. It's because it renamed it to the top level. Yeah, okay. So can I just drag this? No, I have to rename it up here. All right, that's good to know. I didn't know that it did that. So I need the directory in there, scratch B1, rename this to scratch B2, rename. So now they should be in scratch. There they are. And I'll rename this to, okay, yeah, scratch. I just wanted to touch this part, B3. All right, cool. So now that I have that, let's do something. Let's go back to my HTML. And I just want to add my images inside of my image container. So right now, just refresh because there's nothing in that. In fact, you probably won't even be able to see it. And I want to add my 3 images. So I'm going to say image source equals b1.jpg. I don't even know if you need that slash, but whatever. And b2 and b3, b2 and b3. And I'm just going to hit refresh on here because I don't think this is quite what I want, but we'll see. And no, it's not. I mean, sorry if you don't like bees, but here's a giant picture of bees. These are huge pictures and ridiculous. So let's try to fix that. So I have this div that's sort of in the middle of everything, and that is, if I go to paint, that's this box here, sort of in the middle, if you can see that. And so what I'm going to do is image container. I'm going to style that. And I want to say dot image dash container. And I want to say display colon flex. I want to hit save. And I want to refresh. And they're still huge. So, all right, maybe what I need to do is say images will have a width of, I don't know, 200 pixels. So now if I refresh, hopefully, yeah, all right, cool. And so if I compare this to my beautiful Microsoft Paint rendition, it's, you know, pretty close. Maybe I could have done a better job of aligning this. Maybe that goes up there. But this is how I think about sort of laying things out in a web page using Flex and using divs. And there's a bunch of stuff we can do to customize it, but that's like roughly how I think about it. And then I would go in and say, oh, wait a second, actually, I want, you know, this to be a little smaller. How would I do that? Well, I go back to searching for CSS properties and Flex properties and applying them, trying them out and refreshing and, you know, applying that process by looking it up. So I might say like, I don't know, CSS Flex, I don't know, restrict width, you know, something like that. And here we go, controlling ratios of flex items along the main axis. That's sort of a really long title, but limit width with Flexbox. Here's the page I was just looking at, and so on and so forth. You could read more to figure out the property to use and apply it that way. Okay, so we're just about at the end. I do want to show you, you know, one more thing, and then I'll show you a bonus thing for anyone who has stuck around this long. So the first thing I want to show you is, so right now we have this flex website, which lays things out kind of reasonably, kind of no matter what the width is of my container. However, that's kind of a lie, actually, because if I go really tiny, then things start to get really weird. So stuff's going like off the right edge of my screen. I have to kind of scroll horizontally, and stuff is not looking great. And you can imagine that this is what happens if you load your web page on a phone. And so what many websites do is they have different styles for small screens, like a phone screen, and different styles for a bigger screen. And the way you do that is through some syntax that I never remember. So I'm going to go look that up. That's here, sure, somewhere in here. It's this, it's a media query. So I'm just going to copy this and then I'll talk about it. So in my CSS, what I want to do is specify For different screen widths, I want different styles. And so I'm just going to paste the line of code that I just stole in here. So I'll zoom in a little bit. I'm going to paste it. And what I'm going to do is point out some of the syntax. So this is called a media query in CSS. And this is saying if my media is a screen, the other option is like printing out, if you print out the website on a piece of paper, but whatever, just use screen for now. And my minimum width is 700. So I'm actually going to change this to max width. I think this will work. I want to, let's say my Flex container will have a background of lime. And so what this should do is, if I save this, what this is saying is if the screen is a maximum of 700 pixels, then style the Flex container with a background of like lime green. So if I hit refresh, nothing should change yet. But as I make my window smaller, at some point, there it goes. So as I've made my screen smaller, this kicks in. So I'm like right around here is 700 pixels. So if I make it bigger again, that is no longer triggered. And what this lets me do is specify different styling for the different sizes. And so let's say, yeah, I'll stick with 700. That's actually, it's more like, let's see, when does it get wonky? Right around there. So I want to call that like 800, which is actually a pretty common number to choose. So I'm going to hit refresh, and when does 800 kick in? Right, it's more like 850. You know, it doesn't really matter. It kind of depends on your website. I probably shouldn't be spending this time on this, but 850 is there. Wait, what? Did I mess it up? Oh, did I forget the pixels? I did. Do I need that? I think I do. There we go. All right, so 850 is there. Okay, so that's a good level to have it like kick in. And what do I want to do? I want to make, maybe I'll start by having my main Flex container no longer display its children elements next to each other, like sort of left to right. So in my Flexbox guide, I'm going to scroll down until I see something that looks like what I'm looking for. And I didn't have to look far because here it is, Flex direction. The default is to lay them out sort of left to right, but I can make them go up and down as well. And so that is Flex direction of column. So I'm going to say Flex direction column. So this is saying if my screen is smaller than 850 pixels, set the Flex direction of my Flex container to column so that they line up on top of each other vertically, which is kind of the old school way to do it. So I'm going to hit refresh over here. And if I make this smaller, at some point, now, instead of being left to right, they are top to bottom. And you can imagine that if I'm on a phone, this is probably an easier way to render it or to look at it. You know, other than the lime green. We'll get rid of that in a second. And now let's do the same thing with my image container. So what was that? It was just image container. So Flex container, I'm going to do the exact same thing. .image dash container. And I'm going to say Flex direction column and close that out. So now I'm saying if I'm smaller than 850 pixels, then do the same thing with my image container and make my images up and down instead of left and right. So did I save that? Now I did. Make that bigger, refresh, nothing should happen. There's my beautiful bee images. And if I make this smaller, so like right now, it's just Flex doing Flex things because it's sort of changing like the wrapping and stuff and the widths of the individual divs. But once I get smaller than that 850 pixels, my media query will kick in, and there we go. And my left nav is now up top. My images are sort of over here, and my right div is sort of on the right over there. So I could keep playing with this. And so what I might say is I could maybe center these images. And so I don't know, I'll do that quick. I'll say, where's what I want? I think that would be the one we were looking at earlier. Align items. Maybe, no, it's, I think it might be the space. Yeah, it's justify content actually. No, it's not. It's, you know what? I'm going to try align items. We're going to find out. Bear with me. Align items, and I'll say center. And now refresh. And yay, that worked. All right, cool. And that shouldn't break anything if I'm this way, because it only kicks in when I'm like this. And you can imagine, again, if I'm on a phone, this is, you know, maybe a little bit easier to read than if I was trying to look at it this way and needing to like horizontally scroll. Okay, so that is media queries, and that is how you show different layouts on different screen sizes. And I know this video is a little longer than I usually like to make them, but I'll do one more thing for the folks who stuck around. And so, hi, if you're still around, thank you for sticking around. The last thing I will show is basically like the first line of code or set of lines of code that I use in pretty much every website that I design. So if I look at this right now, yeah, sure, I'm using Flexbox and, you know, I'm using layout, I have a media query, all that good stuff, but the website is still taking up the whole width. And that is a default style that is just kind of like, I don't know how it works if you don't do anything about it. And that's usually not how most websites operate. And so I don't know if I go to a random website, let's see if this is a good example. No, it's not. No, it's not. Here, this is a good example. So website I was just looking at with Flexbox, like this is not taking up the whole space because it has sort of margins on the left and right. And the content is pretty much centered. NeoCities is maybe, oh, well, this is the editor, so it takes up the whole screen. But if I go like back to the home page, like, yeah, you kind of see that like there's space on the left and there's space on the right to center everything on a really big monitor, which is what most people have. And if I go to my website, like, you know, here's an example of it, where there's space on the left and space on the right, so that what you're reading is a little easier to read than, where'd my page go? Than this. Where if it's taking up the whole width, it's like this gets hard to read because your eye has to move like much more left to right just to get to the next line. And so to fix that, it's actually relatively few lines of code, but let's run through that. So what I will normally do is I usually do this before I have any other content. So bear with me, but what I'll have is inside of the body, I will have a single div that contains everything else. And I usually call this something like container or something, or page container, content container. And then I have to close out my div all the way down here. There's probably a red X. Yeah, there it is. So /div. And then I'm going to be extra annoying and try to fix my white space. So this div all the way up to this needs to be indented. Okay. And so now I have this div, which is a container that, well, contains everything else. And I could add another border, but, you know, maybe I will actually. But in here, I will have a dot container style rule. And in here, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to first specify something like a max dash width, and I'm going to give it a value of, I don't know, maybe like 1,000 pixels. 1000 pixels. In here, I will also give it a border of thick, solid. I'm definitely running out of colors. I'll just orange, maybe. uh, and I'll start there. So I'm going to hit save and I'm going to refresh. And I'm going to bring this back over here. So I'm going to refresh. And okay, so I've got my orange border that sort of contains everything else. The border is really just to show you where the div is. Everything else is inside of my orange border. And my orange border has a width of 1000 pixels. It's actually a max width, so it will get smaller, but it won't get bigger. And so by default, it's all the way to the left, which, might be what you want, but it means that all your white space is over here to the right. And so if I add one more line of code, so I have my max width, 1000 pixels, and I have this magic line of code, which is margin : auto. If I save that and I bring that back over, if I refresh, now the container div is centered in my whole page, and then the rest is flex. So if I sort of decrease this in size, eventually it'll kick in and it'll line it up this way. I could also set the same thing if I am in my small screen. So sure, let me do that. And so I'll say like dot container inside of my media query. And in here, I will say, I don't know, max width of, instead of 1000, let's make it like, I don't know, 500 pixels. And so what will that look like? If I refresh, here it is. It's at its 1000. And if I scroll, if I make it smaller, eventually it'll kick in. And why didn't that work? Oh, it's because, wait, why? Container, max width, max width. Hmm. Hmm. That should work. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to say this happens all of the time in coding. Something is weird, something is not totally making sense, and it's not doing what I expect it to. And this is normal. I've been doing this for, 20 something years, and it happens to me every day. And I debated kind of editing this part out, but, you know, I think it's important to show that this is a normal part of the process. So the way I would start to understand this is by using some of the tools that we've seen. So I'm going to right click this and I'm going to inspect, and I'm thinking to myself, like, what I expect is this container should have a max width of 500 pixels because of this, right? So I'm looking at this, the inspect element sort of section here, and I notice here that this is triggered. It is saying, the media query is here, and it's saying container max width 500 pixels. That is right there. And it's grayed out and sort of crossed out, which means that it's being replaced by another property. This is actually the cascading part of cascading style sheets, and it's being replaced by the 1000, which is indeed the default. This is a little surprising to me because I would have thought that the media query is the more specific style. We sort of talked about that a little bit last time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for this problem. I'm going to say, CSS media query, max width not overriding. Spoiler alert, I did look this up, but this is the process I followed. And sure, this Stack Overflow is usually pretty good. And I'm going to look at the first answer, and that looks confusing, and I'm not sure all about that. Oh, here, right here. Well, mixed feelings about AI, but here we go. If your max width media query is not overriding styles, ensure that it is placed after the original CSS rules in your style sheet, as CSS applies the last defined rule. Huh. Okay, I think I knew that, but I just assumed that a media query would be more specific than a non-media query, but I guess not. So I will do that. I will cut this and paste it to the bottom. And there's a couple ways I could format that, but this is how I would generally do it. And I'm going to fix actually my white space is okay. Okay. And so now what it's going to say is, here's the default styles to apply. And if you have a screen width that's less than this or less than or equal to this, then overwrite all of those styles with these. I think the reason that it worked before was because, like, by default, this didn't have a background. By default, these were just not set. They were just, well, they were the defaults. Whereas this, I did have a default value set. So anyway, I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh. And now if I make it bigger, eventually, there we go. Now my content has a max width of 500 pixels, even if I'm still in that sort of small screen environment. So if I make this a little bigger, it'll go back to its normal thing. And if I close this, then here's my normal thing. And if I make it smaller, smaller, now I'm at 850 pixels and my content is 500 pixels, which, you know, might make it a little easier to read on a smaller screen. And if I make it smaller, the content itself stays the same width, but my white space goes away. And then eventually it'll get smaller and smaller until it's, like, you know, not really reasonable. But even this is still a pretty reasonable layout, actually, even though it's like teeny tiny. Like, this is smaller than a phone would be. Okay, so I think I'm going to end it there. This got a little longer than I originally intended, but CSS layout is complicated. And Flexbox is weird because you kind of lose control. You choose to not have as much control because you are saying, hey, Flex, do the best you can. And here's some hints at how I want you to behave, but you're not really worrying about exact pixel values anymore. You are trusting that Flex does the right thing. And the way that you provide those hints is by setting properties on your container and on your children. And what those properties are is searchable, researchable. This page is great. This dude is great. And I always look at this when I'm messing with Flex stuff. So add this to your list of best friends right next to W3 schools and MDN. And then towards the end, we also got into media queries, which help you have different layouts for different screen sizes. And as a little extra bonus, I showed you how to center your content in a page instead of having that kind of annoying default styling of taking up the whole page. So from here, it's a matter of applying all of this, and I'll see you in the next video where we actually do a project with all of the above. So for now, I'll say thanks for watching, and as always, of course, happy coding.